Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 8 of our reading of George Orwell's 1984. Now, first of all, the copyright information, as it says here, all rights reserved, including the right to reproduce this book or portions thereof in any form. So I am taking that as permission to actually read the book on my stream or on my YouTube channel. Anyways, I also want to, I always have to do the disclaimer here. This book deals with topics and subjects that normally I wouldn't discuss on my channel. It does deal with bigotry, racism, violence, and later on torture. But anyways, I'm just saying that I don't really approve of these things, but I believe that they are in the book to basically be over the top and advance the story. So, anyways, that said, we are going to read this. Apparently, Winston is writing about a prostitute or something. I don't know. We're going to find out. Because he saw himself standing there in the dim lamplight with the smell of bugs and cheap scent in his nostrils, which I guess would be like cheap perfume. The party women, the ones of the political party or whatever, that run the place don't wear perfume or makeup or anything like that. Only the proles do, which is like the poor class. And in his heart, a feeling of defeat and resentment, which even at that moment was mixed up with the thought of Catherine's white body frozen forever by the hypnotic power of the party. Why did it always have to be like this? Why could he not have a woman of his own instead of these filthy scuffles at intervals of years? But a real love affair was an almost unthinkable event. The women of the party were all alike. Chastity was as deeply ingrained in them as party loyalty, but by careful early conditioning, by games in cold water, by the rubbish that was dinned into them at school and in the spies and the youth league, by lectures, parades, songs, slogans, and martial music, the natural feeling had been driven out of them. His reason told him that there must be exceptions, but his heart did not believe it. They were all impregnable, as the party intended that they should be, and what he wanted more even than to be loved was to break down that wall of virtue, even if it were only once in his life. The sexual act successfully performed was rebellion. Desire was thought crime. Even to have awakened Catherine, if he could have achieved it, he would have liked a seduction, although she was his wife. But the rest of the story had got to be written down. He wrote, "I turned up the lamp when I saw her in the light. After the darkness, the feeble light of the paraffin lamp seemed very bright. For the first time, he could see the woman properly. He had taken a step towards her and then halted. Full of lust and terror, he was painfully conscious of the risk he had taken in coming here. It was perfectly possible that the patrols would catch him on the way out. For that matter, they might be waiting outside the door at this moment if he went away without even doing what he had come here to do. It had got to be written down. It had got to be confessed. What he had suddenly seen in the lamplight was that the woman was old. The paint was plastered so thick on her face that it looked as though it might crack like a cardboard mask. There were streaks of white in her hair, but the truly dreadful detail was that her mouth had fallen a little open, revealing nothing except a cavernous blackness. She had no teeth at all. He wrote hurriedly in scrabbling handwriting. Wait. 58. Okay. When I saw her in the light, she was quite an old woman, 50 years old at least, but I went ahead and did it just the same. He pressed his fingers against his eyelids again. He had written it down at last, but it made no difference. The therapy had not worked. The urge to shout filthy words at the top of his voice was as strong as ever. Okay, we are to chapter 7 now. I don't know how many chapters there are. I don't remember. I think there's like 23 chapters. Anyways, if there is hope, wrote Winston, it lies in the proles. If there was hope, it must lie in the proles, because only there, in those swarming, disregarded masses, 85% of the population of Oceania, would be could the force to destroy the party ever be generated. The party could not be overthrown from within. Its enemies, if it had any enemies, had no way of coming together or even of identifying one another, even if the legendary brotherhood existed. As just possibly it might, it was inconceivable that its members could ever assemble in large numbers, in larger numbers than twos and threes. Rebellion meant a look in the eyes, an inflection of the voice, at the most an occasional whispered word, but the proles, if only they could somehow become conscious of their own strength, would have no need to conspire. They needed only to rise up and shake themselves like a horse shaking off flies. I like the horse reference, the horse shaking off flies. If they chose, they could blow the party to pieces tomorrow morning. Surely, sooner or later, it must occur to them to do it. And yet, He remembered how once he had been walking down a crowded street when a tremendous shout of hundreds of voices, women's voices, had burst from a side street, a little way ahead. It was a great, formidable cry of anger and despair, a deep, loud "Oh!" and went humming on like the reverberations of a bell. His heart had leapt. It started, he had thought. A riot. The proles are breaking loose at last. When he had reached the spot, it was to see a mob of 200 or 300 women crowding around the stalls of a street market, with faces as tragic as though they had been the doomed passengers on a sinking ship. But at this moment, the general despair broke down into a multitude of individual quarrels. It appeared that one of the stalls had been selling 10 saucepans. They were wretched, flimsy things, but cooking pots of any kind were always difficult to get. Now the supply had unexpectedly given out, and the unsuccessful women, bumped and jostled by the rest, were trying to make off with their saucepans, while dozens of others clamored around the stall, accusing the stall-keeper of favoritism and of having more saucepans somewhere in reserve. There was a fresh outburst of yells. 2 bloated women, one of them with her hair coming down, had got a hold of the same saucepan, gotten a hold of the same saucepan, and were trying to tear it out of one another's hands. For a moment they were both tugging, and then the handle came off. Winston watched them disgustedly, and yet just for a moment was almost frightening power had sounded in that cry from only a few hundred throats. Why was it that they could never shout like that about anything that mattered? Until they become conscious, they will never rebel, and until after they have rebelled, they cannot become conscious. That he reflected might almost have been the transcription from one of the party textbooks. The party claimed, of course, to have liberated the proles from bondage. Before the revolution, they had been hideously oppressed by the capitalists. They had been starved and flogged. Women had been forced to work in the coal mines. Women still did work in the coal mines, as a matter of fact. Children had been sold into the factories at the age of 6, but simultaneously, true to the principles of doublethink, the party taught that the proles were natural inferiors, who must be kept in subjugation like animals by the application of a few simple rules. In reality, very little was known about the proles. It was not necessary to know much, so long as they continued to work and breed. Their other activities were without importance. Left to themselves like cattle turned loose upon the plains of Argentina, they had reverted to a style of life that appeared to be partial to them, a sort of ancestral pattern. They were born, they grew up in the gutters. They went to work at 12. They passed through a brief blossoming period of beauty and sexual desire and married at 20. They were middle-aged at 30 and died, for the most part, at 60. Heavy physical work, the care of home and children, petty quarrels with neighbors, films, football, beer, and above all, gambling filled up the horizon of their minds. To keep them in control was not difficult. A few agents of the thought police moved always among them, spreading false rumors and marking down and eliminating the few individuals who were judged capable of becoming dangerous. But no attempt was made to indoctrinate them with the ideology of the party. It was not desirable that the proles should have strong political feelings. All that was required of them was a primitive patriotism, which could be appealed to whenever it was necessary to make them accept longer working hours or shorter rations. And even when they became discontented, as they sometimes did, their discontent led nowhere, because being without general ideas, they could only focus in on petty specific grievances. The larger evils invariably escaped their notice. The great majority of proles did not even have telescreens in their homes. Even the civil police interfered with them very little. There was a vast amount of criminality in London, a whole world within a world of thieves, bandits, prostitutes, drug peddlers, and racketeers of every description. But since it was all happening among the proles themselves, it was of no importance in all questions of morals. They were allowed to follow their ancestral code. The sexual Puritanism of the party was not imposed upon them. Promiscuity went unpunished. Divorce was permitted. For that matter, even religious worship would have been permitted if the proles had shown any sign of needing or wanting it. They were beneath suspicion, as the party slogan put it. Proles and animals are free. Winston reached down and cautiously scratched his varicose ulcer, and it had begun itching again. The thing you invariably come back to was the improbability of knowing what life before the revolution had really been like. He took out of the drawer a copy of a children's history textbook, which he had borrowed from Mrs. Parsons, and began copying passages into the diary. Okay, this ought to be good. Let's see here. In the old days, it ran, before the glorious revolution. Revolution. London was not the beautiful city that we know today. It was a dark, dirty, miserable place where hardly anybody had enough to eat, and where hundreds and thousands of poor people had no boots on their feet and not even a roof to sleep under. Children no older than you are had to work 12 hours a day for cruel masters who flogged them with whips if they worked too slowly, and fed them on nothing but stale bread crusts and water. But in among all this terrible poverty, there were just a few great big beautiful houses that 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 were lived in by rich men who had as many as 30 servants to look after them. These rich men were called capitalists. They were fat, ugly men with wicked faces, like the ones in the picture on the opposite page. You can see that he is dressed in a long black coat, which was called a frock coat, and a queer, shiny hat shaped like a stovepipe, which was called a top hat. This was the uniform of the capitalists, and no one else was allowed to wear it. The capitalists owned everything in the world, and everyone else was their slave. They owned all the land, all the houses, all the factories, and all the money. If anyone disobeyed them, they could throw him into prison, or they could take his job away and starve him to death. When any ordinary person spoke to a capitalist, he had to cringe and bow to him and take off his cap and address him as sir. The chief of all the capitalists was called the king, but he knew the rest of the catalog. There would be mention of the bishops in their lawn sleeves, the judges in their ermine robes, the pillory, the stocks, the treadmill, the cat o' nine tails, the Lord Mayor's banquet, and the practice of kissing the Pope's toe. There was also something called the ius prime noctis, which would probably not be mentioned in a textbook for children. It was a law by which every capitalist had the right to sleep with any woman working in one of his factories. How could you tell how much of it was lies? It might be true that the average human being was better off now than he had been before the revolution. The only evidence to the contrary was the mute protest in your own bones, the instinctive feeling that the conditions you lived in were intolerable, and that at some other time they may have been different. It struck him that the truly characteristic thing about modern life was not its cruelty and insecurity, but simply the bareness, its dinginess, its listlessness. Life, if you looked about you, bore no resemblance not only to the lies that streamed out of the telescreen, but even to the ideals that the party was trying to achieve. Great areas of it, even for a party member, were neutral and non-political, a matter of slogging through dreary jobs, fighting for a place on the tube, darning the worn-out sock, cadging a saccharin tablet, saving a cigarette end. The ideal setup by the party was something huge, terrible, and glittering. A world of steel and concrete, a monstrous machine and terrible weapons, a nation of warriors and fanatics, marching forward in perfect unity, all thinking the same thoughts and shouting the same slogans, perpetually working, fighting, triumphing, persecuting 300 million people, all with the same face. The reality was decaying, dingy cities where underfed people shuffled to and fro in leaky shoes, in patched-up 19th century houses that smelt always of cabbage and bad lavatories. He seemed to see a vision of London, vast and ruinous, city of a million dust bins, and mixed up with it was a picture of Mrs. Parsons, a woman with lined face and wispy hair, fiddling helplessly with a blocked waste pipe. He reached down and scratched his ankle again. Day and night, the telescreen bruised your ears with statistics proving that people today had more food, more clothes, better houses, better recreations, and they lived longer, worked shorter hours, were bigger, healthier, stronger, happier, more intelligent, better educated than the people of 50 years ago. Not a word of it could ever be proved or disproved. The party claimed, for example, that today 40% of adult proles were literate. Before the revolution, it was said the number had only been 15%. The party claimed that the infant mortality rate was now only 160 per thousand, whereas before the revolution it had been 300. And so it went on. It was like a single education with two unknowns, or a single equation rather, with two unknowns. Two unknowns. It might very well have been literally every word in the history books, even the things that no one accepted without question, was pure fantasy. For all he knew, there might never have been any such law as the jus prime noctis, or any such creature as a capitalist, or any such garment as a top hat. Everything faded into mist. The past was erased. The erasure was forgotten. The lie became truth. Just once in his life, he had possessed, after the event, that was what counted. Concrete, unmistakable evidence of an act of falsification. He had held it between his fingers for as long as 30 seconds in 1973. It must have been. At any rate, it was at about the time when he and Catherine had parted, but the really relevant date was 7 or 8 years earlier. The story really began in the middle of the 60s, the period of the Great Purges, in which the original leaders of the revolution were wiped out once and for all. By 1970, none of them was left, except Big Brother himself. All the rest had, by that time, been exposed as traitors and counter-revolutionaries. Goldstein had fled and was hiding no one knew where, and of the others, a few had simply disappeared, while the majority had been executed after spectacular public trials at which they made confessions of their crimes. Among the last survivors were 3 men named Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford. It must have been in 1965 that these 3 had been arrested. As often happened, they had vanished for a year or more, so that one did not know whether they were alive or dead, and then had suddenly been brought forth to incriminate themselves in the usual way. They had confessed to intelligence with the enemy. At that date, too, the enemy was Eurasia. Embezzlement of public funds, the murder of various trusted party members, intrigues against the leadership of Big Brother, which had started long before the revolution happened, and acts of sabotage causing the death of hundreds and of thousands of people. After confessing to these things, they had been pardoned, reinstated in the party, and given posts where in fact, since posts which were in fact sinecures, but which sounded important. All 3 had written long, abject articles in the Times analyzing the reasons for their defection and promises to make amends. Sometime after their release, Winston had actually seen all 3 of them in the Chestnut Tree Cafe. He remembered the sort of terrified fascination with which he had watched them out of the corner of his eye. They were men far older than himself, relics of the ancient world, almost the last great figures left over from the heroic early days of the party. The glamour of the underground struggle and the Civil War still faintly clung to them. He had the feeling though already at that time facts and dates were growing blurry, that he had known their names years earlier than he had known that of Big Brother, but also they were outlaws, enemies, untouchables, doomed with absolute certainty to execution, no, to extinction within a year or two. No one who had once fallen into the hands of the thought police ever escaped in the end. They were corpses waiting to be sent back to the grave. There was no one in any of the tables nearest to them. It was not wise even to be seen in the neighborhood of such people. They were sitting in silence before glasses of the gin flavored with cloves, which was the specialty of the cafe. Of the three, it was Rutherford whose appearance had most impressed Winston. Rutherford had once been a famous caricaturist whose brutal cartoons had helped to inflame popular opinion before and during the Revolution. Even now, at long intervals, his cartoons were appearing in the Times. They were simply an imitation of the earlier manner and curiously lifeless and unconvincing. Always, they were a rehashing of the ancient themes. Slum tenements, starving children, street battles, capitalists in top hats, even the barricades the capitalists still seem to cling to their top hats. An endless, hopeless effort to get back into the past. He was a monstrous man with a mane of greasy gray hair. His face pouched and seamed with protuberant lips. At one time, he must have been immensely strong. Now, his great body was sagging, sloping, bulging, falling away in every direction. He seemed to be breaking up before one's eyes like a mountain crumbling. We are going to, we're at 27 minutes. We're going to stop right here right now. Let me remind where we are. Okay. We are going to do that. Okay. Okay, we have been reading from George Orwell's 1984. If you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. And if you want to support me in any way, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.